This wasn't just any British car. This was the car chosen by Queen Elizabeth II herself. Not a Rolls-Royce, not a Bentley, but a quiet, understated Rover. It carried royalty, power, and prestige through the heart of Britain for over a decade, and yet today, almost nobody remembers it. So how did the most important car in Britain simply vanish from history? Imagine the year is 1979. Britain has just gone through the winter of discontent. Rubbish bags piled in Leicester Square. The dead, lying unburied in some councils. And on the 4th of May of that year, a woman steps out of a car on Downing Street and changes the course of British history. That woman was Margaret Thatcher. And the car? A Rover P5B. A machine that had rolled off the Solihull production line 7 years earlier. Out of production, nearly a decade old, and yet there it was, carrying the new Prime Minister to the door of number 10. That single image tells you almost everything you need to know about this extraordinary car. Now, here's the question this video sets out to answer. Why, given all of that, is the Rover P5 so thoroughly overlooked today? Go to any major classic car event in Britain or America, and you're more likely to see a dozen E-types or a row of American muscle cars than a single P5. Yet this was a car that Queen Elizabeth II drove herself without a chauffeur on the roads of Britain. A car that carried no fewer than 4 consecutive British Prime Ministers. A car built by the same team of engineers who would go on to create the Range Rover. To understand the Rover P5, you have to understand the world it was born into. Britain, in 1958, was still finding its feet after the war. The Suez Crisis of 1956 had bruised national confidence. Petrol rationing had only ended in May of that year. And yet, beneath the surface, something was stirring. Harold Macmillan would soon tell the country it had never had it so good. There was a quiet hunger for quality, for craftsmanship, for a car that said something about who you were without the vulgarity of showing off. That is exactly the gap the Rover P5 was designed to fill, and for 15 years it filled it brilliantly. This is its story. Section 1. Birth of a British institution, design, development, and the 1958 launch. The Rover Company in Solihull had always occupied a particular corner of the British market. Not quite Rolls-Royce, not quite Jaguar, but somewhere altogether its own respected, solid, trustworthy. The cars they built in the late 40s and early 50s, the P3 and P4, had that quality. But by the mid-50s, the P4 was starting to look its age. The market was moving. Rover needed something new. What they originally had in mind was rather modest. In the early 1950s, managing director Maurice Wilks envisaged what the engineers were calling a light P4, a simpler, cheaper car, using a new floor and chassis construction. The internal target was a selling price of around £650, lighter, more economical, 30 miles to the gallon, if possible. What they actually built was something rather different. By the time the car had grown through design and development through the hands of stylist David Bash and engineers Spen King and Gordon Bashford, it had become a full-sized luxury saloon. The weight had ballooned to 3,200 weight, which is just over 1,600 kilograms. The intended price target was long gone. But in its place, Rover had created something genuinely impressive. It's worth pausing on those 3 names, Bash, King, and Bashford, because you may recognize what they went on to do. All 3 were key members of the team that later designed and engineered the original Range Rover. Think about that. The people who gave the world the Range Rover cut their teeth on the Rover P5. The P5 was also significant for another reason that tends to get overlooked. It was the first Rover to use unitary or monocoque body construction. Until then, Rover had built their cars the traditional way, a separate body sitting on a separate chassis frame. The P5 did away with all of that. The body and structure were integrated into a single unit, with inner panels stressed as part of the car's engineering. Gordon Bashford later recalled that because there was no computer-aided design in those days, all the stress engineering had to be done by mathematical calculation and physical testing, particularly what the engineers called pavé testing. which meant hammering the prototype over cobblestones until something broke or proved it wouldn't. The car that emerged from all this effort was unveiled to the press and public at the Earl's Court Motor Show in London in September of 1958, badged simply as the Rover 3-litre. Under the long bonnet sat a 2,995 cubic centimetre straight-six engine, using an unusual valve arrangement that Rover had carried over from the P4, what engineers call inlet over exhaust, with an overhead intake valve and a side exhaust valve. It was an old-fashioned layout even then, but it produced an engine of remarkable smoothness. Power output was claimed at 115 brake horsepower. The press reception at Earl's Court was generally warm. Motorsport magazine noted the new engine, developing 115 brake horsepower at 4,250 revolutions per minute, and the panoramic windscreen giving a sense of space that one contemporary journalist likened to a large American saloon. But when road testers actually got their hands on cars in the months that followed, the results were more sobering. The top speed was 96 miles per hour, which, for a car of this size and price, was not exactly inspiring. 0 to 60 took a yawning 16.2 seconds. The gear change, closely derived from the P4, was criticized as notchy, and the steering, without power assistance, was on the heavy side for a car weighing what this one did. Rover responded quickly. By October of 1959, just over a year after the launch, front disc brakes had been fitted, replacing the original 11-inch drum brakes all around. In September of 1961, the Mark 1A arrived with minor bodywork updates, including added front quarter windows and, critically, an optional hydrosteer power-assisted steering system that transformed the car's drivability. But even in its earliest, most imperfect form, the Rover 3-litre had one trump card that no road test figure could measure: the interior. David Bash had created a cabin that blended traditional mahogany veneer and genuine leather with an almost club-like atmosphere. As one contemporary observer put it, only the Bentley was said to have a better interior. That comparison was not made lightly. Section 2, a car for the establishment, the coupe, the crown, and the keys to Downing Street. In 1962, Rover introduced the Mark II version of the P5, and with it, one of the most quietly elegant body styles in British motor industry history, the four-door coupe. Now, when most people hear the word coupe, they think of a two-door car with a sloping roofline, something sporty, something youthful. The Rover coupe was neither of those things, and that was precisely the point. It kept all four doors. It kept the same width and length as the saloon. What changed was the roofline, which was lowered by 2.5 inches, the B-pillars, which were made thinner, and the overall profile, which took on a long, low, almost hardtop appearance. The result was a car that managed to look simultaneously more rakish and more dignified, a combination very few designers have ever pulled off. The Mark II also brought a modest power increase. The same 2,995 cubic centimetre engine, now producing 129 brake horsepower, along with a revised suspension and the fitment of quarter-light windows on the front doors. Hydrosteer power steering was now standard on the coupe and optional on the saloon. By the time Mark II production ended in 1965, 5,482 coupes and 15,676 saloons had been built. The Mark III arrived in 1965, bringing the engine output up again to 134 brake horsepower. It was a further refinement, rather than a transformation. This was a car that Rover understood did not need to shout. It needed to whisper, convincingly. And it was whispering in the right ears. In February of 1961, Queen Elizabeth II took delivery of her first Rover P5, a Mark I saloon, registered JGY 280 and finished in dark green. She had not sent a chauffeur to collect it. She drove it herself. This was a private car, used for personal motoring, not state occasions, and that distinction matters. The Queen had Rolls-Royces and Daimlers for the ceremonial side of royal life. The Rover P5 was what she chose when she simply wanted to go somewhere. The Queen Mother also took delivery of a similar 3-litre car, registered VUL4, In May of that same year, with a discreet radio aerial lamp at the base of the roof to identify it when in use by a member of the royal family. By the mid-1960s, the P5 had also become the standard ministerial transport for senior members of the British government. It displaced earlier official cars and became the backbone of what was then called the government car service, carrying cabinet ministers to Parliament, to meetings, and to public engagements. The government had a clear preference for British-manufactured vehicles that projected stability and reliability rather than ostentation, and the Rover P5 embodied those qualities exactly. Harold Wilson became the first Prime Minister to use the P5 when he took office in 1964. Edward Heath followed, then James Callaghan, then Margaret Thatcher. 4 consecutive Prime Ministers, spanning the full political spectrum from Labour, left to Conservative right, and all of them chose the same car. That is not a coincidence. That is a testament. Section 3. The P5B, an American engine, in a very British suit. By the mid-1960s, Rover faced a familiar problem. The 3-liter straight-six engine, for all its smoothness, was getting long in the tooth. The market was evolving, performance expectations were rising, and Rover simply did not have the resources to develop an entirely new engine from scratch. British Leyland's formation in 1968 would only make that funding situation worse. Rover needed a solution, and they found one in the most unlikely of places, the American Midwest. Rover's managing director, William Martin Hurst, was visiting Wisconsin on business when he came across a discarded Buick engine, a 3.5-liter all-aluminium V8 that Buick had developed in the early 1960s and then quietly abandoned. General Motors had found the all-aluminium construction difficult and expensive to manufacture to the tolerances required, and had dropped it in favor of a conventional cast-iron unit. Martin Hurst recognized immediately what he was looking at. Here was a compact, lightweight, beautifully smooth V8 engine abandoned by one of the largest car companies in the world and available for purchase. Rover moved swiftly, acquiring both the engine design and the manufacturing tooling from Buick's motor division. In Rover's hands, the engineers set about making the block considerably stronger, which added some weight, but maintained the engine's fundamentally light and compact character. The result was what Rover called the 3.5-liter V8, and what became, in various forms, one of the longest-lived and most widely used engines in British automotive history. You would find versions of this engine powering Land Rovers, Range Rovers, Triumph TR8s, Morgan Plus 8s, and TVRs well into the 1990s and beyond. The engine that Buick threw away became one of the great workhorses of the British motor industry. In September of 1967, Rover fitted this engine into the P5 body shell and launched what became known as the P5B, the B standing for Buick, acknowledging the engine's origins quite openly. The specifications were a significant step forward. Engine displacement was 3,528 cubic centimeters. Power output was claimed at 160 brake horsepower at 5,200 revolutions per minute. Torque came in at 210 pounds-feet at 2,600 revolutions per minute. The aluminium construction meant the new engine was actually lighter than the iron block 6 it replaced, which, combined with the additional power, transformed the car's performance. Top speed climbed to around 110 miles per hour. The P5B was a genuinely fast car, fast and smooth, which is a combination not every car achieves. All P5B models were fitted with the Borg-Warner Type 35 automatic transmission as standard. There was no manual option. The Hydrosteer variable ratio power steering became standard across the board. And externally, the P5B was distinguished from its predecessors by bold 3.5-liter badging, a pair of Lucas fog lights mounted below the headlights to create a distinctive 4-light arrangement, and chromed row-style wheels with black painted inserts. So, why did Britain choose to forget the Rover P5? Partly, it was the chaos of British Leyland, that great industrial slow-motion disaster that swallowed Rover's identity and spat out something rather different in its place. Partly, it was the damage done to the Rover name in the 1980s, when the brand was repositioned and diluted until it meant almost nothing. And partly, perhaps mostly, it's simply that the P5 was never a car that went looking for attention. It was designed to carry serious people to serious places, quietly and without fuss. And it did exactly that. The engineers who built it went on to create the Range Rover. The Queen drove one for decades. 5 prime ministers were carried in them. The engine survived in British cars for 30 years after the P5 itself was gone. These are not the credentials of a forgotten car, and yet here we are. If you're looking at the classic car market today, the P5 and P5B represent what the enthusiast world sometimes calls a sleeper, a car whose significance and quality have yet to be reflected in its price. An average P5B in reasonable condition can be found for around £11,000. The very finest examples at auction have reached £47,250. For a car of this provenance, this history, and this quality of engineering, those figures still seem remarkably modest. The coupe, in particular, has a visual elegance that holds up 50 years on. Bashy's lowered roofline, the chrome Raw-style wheels, that 4-light nose, it looks like a car that was designed with total conviction. And the Rover V8 engine, once you've heard it, is something you don't forget. Smooth, torquey, and with a character that's completely unlike anything else from that era of British motoring. This was not a car Britain chose to forget. It's a car that got buried under the wreckage of the industry that built it. But the P5 is still out there, if you know where to look, still carrying that particular combination of dignity, craft, and quiet authority that made it the Queen's car of choice for more than a decade. And perhaps that's enough of a reason to give it a second look. If you owned or drove a Rover P5 or P5B, I'd genuinely love to hear about it in the comments below. These cars had owners who knew them well, and your experience is worth far more than any road test from half a century ago. And if this kind of detailed history of underappreciated British classics is the sort of thing you enjoy, please do subscribe. There's a great deal more where this came from. Thank you for watching. And for those of you who already know exactly what this car sounds like pulling away from a set of lights on a cold morning, you know what the rest of us have been missing.